Would you sign a contract before reading it? Would you make a serious agreement without knowing first the details, without understanding the implications? I'm sure every person hearing that question would say, of course. Of course we first have to understand before we act, before we commit. And yet, I'd like to share with you that the true secret of life is the exact opposite. Is to commit even before we fully understand. And here we have one of the greatest events in history. The revelation at Sinai, 3,337 years ago. When the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai, you know what they did? They said to God, we will do, and then we will understand. And of course, the obvious question is, which intelligent person behaves that way? First, you have to know the details. How can I commit to something without understanding what the implications are? Let's discuss this and discover the secret, the true secret to lasting, enduring, and eternal connections. Please join me in this discussion on the Kabbalah of action. Do first, understand later. Hi, this is Simon Jacobson, and we will be discussing the Kabbalah of action. Do first, understand later. This program is dedicated by Deborah Cho in memory of Hoya Yaon. Would you sign a contract before reading it? Would you make a serious agreement, or not even a serious agreement, any agreement, without knowing the details first, the implications, the obligations, the expectations? The very notion sounds ridiculous. Who would commit to something without understanding what it is we're committing to? And yet we find an event in history that one could argue is the most important event of all of history, where a people, an intelligent people, stood at a mountain, Mount Sinai, 3,337 years ago, and were offered a mandate by God. It was called the Torah, the Bible, as it's known. With serious commitment of life, of how we are born and how we die, and how we love, and how we have relationships. Every aspect of life is regulated in this book. A moral, ethical book, a book of spiritual direction and guidance. And what did the people do? They said, we will do, and then we will understand. So we're told, the Talmud tells us, that one of the skeptics asked the question, what kind of reckless, rushed behavior is that? You will do before you understand. You're signing a contract, basically affecting your entire life and the life of generations to come, without knowing what you're going to be committing to? The Talmud even calls it a secret. The secret of the angels. Who first do, and then try to understand. How do we explain that? And most importantly, we shall learn that in this lies the secret to true, lasting commitments, relationships, enduring and eternal connections. So how do we even begin? One of the big challenges of our times is the issue of commitment. You ever hear people say, I have commitment issues, or he has commitment issues, she has commitment issues. Very often, it's different psychological blocks, fears, insecurities, and in general, why take risks, unnecessary risks? So many people stay uncommitted. They keep the door open. In many cases, I said, it's the fear of failure, fear of rejection. And unless we must, we don't necessarily have to commit. But how would life look like if we never made commitments to anything? And I'm not just talking about marriage and personal emotional relationships, but also business decisions and other decisions we make in life. How do we ultimately make a decision when there's pros and cons? Obviously, there are situations that's pretty clear that you should or should not do that. But what about when there's a doubt, even a small doubt? And the stakes are high. Should you take a leap? How do you take a leap? Is it purely based on rationale? We know, not necessarily, because you can do the research and due diligence and still not be sure what to do next. So what is it that pushes a person over from that maybe to yes? Is it an intuition? Is it a leap of faith, as some call it? That's what this story is all about, and that's where the secret lies. Because on the other hand, you have a world where, people are just not committing, whatever excuses and reasons. And we'll even say situations where there's good reason. You're not sure. Why would you take a risk? Stay safe. But we have to dig a little deeper. Maybe begin with the very fact, why is commitment that important in the first place? What's wrong with just living on the fence? Being indecisive, like the guy used to said, I used to think I'm indecisive, now I'm not so sure. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with doubt? Besides the psychological effect that doubts paralyze us, they demoralize us, they weaken us. But is anything really, I'm not going to lose anything if I don't go ahead. If I go ahead, there's always the risk I may not succeed. I think we all know, and there's something that resonates in us, that obviously you could ask philosophical questions all day and play mind games, but there's something about commitment that we sense is very precious and valuable in life. Imagine parents were not committed to their children. When it's convenient, I'm there. When it's not convenient, I'm not. When the children are a nuisance. That concept of unconditional love, unconditional commitment, resonates with us. That doesn't mean in every given situation. Obviously, very often we get committed to something that's not even healthy. Addiction is an example. But even addiction, the root of it is connection. The problem is it's an unhealthy connection. It's a dysfunctional connection. Because connection and attachment is something that is vital to the human being. 9 months we spend in our mother's womb. You don't have more attachment than that. In a sense, all addictions, I would say, are attachment disorders. An attachment that has been severed or misplaced, so you're trying to find an attachment to replace it. So attachment, by definition, is an unconditional concept. If a mother in the middle of pregnancy says, you know what? I don't want to take care of this child any longer. What would life be? And the same thing with all types of love. So that establishes the fact that commitment is critical. The problem is, so how do you commit if you don't know what it says in the contract? So you have to keep in mind, and let's go back to the story of Sinai. You have to keep in mind, it wasn't the first time that the Jewish people met God. They were spent over 200 years in a deep genocide, a Holocaust in Egypt, that enslaved them, that tortured them, that afflicted them, that punished them, and that killed them, yes. Many died at the hands of their tormentors. And it wasn't just 10 years or 15 years, it was hundreds of years. Before that, these people standing at Sinai were the children of the 12 tribes who were children of Jacob and Leah and Rachel and Bilhah and Zilpah, who in turn was a child of Isaac and Rebekah, who in turn was a child of Abraham and Sarah. So we're talking about people of the highest level, refined level, evolved, pioneers, who paid a heavy price to deny a world of paganism and selfishness and commit to a higher purpose. And that's when they began their relationship with God. So they were, so to speak, dating God for a while, for generations. So the people were not coming in a vacuum and suddenly for the first time being offered a contract, a Torah that says, take it or leave it. You have no time to study it. I just want either take it or leave it. No, they already had a relationship. They were dating. But the thing is, you don't want to be a serial dater. Endless. There has to be a point you make a commitment. And they did. They didn't procrastinate further. They could have said, we want to read it in detail, we want to study it. They trusted. But it was a trust not built on naivete or immaturity. It was a trust built on serious experience. And not just in times of joy, but also in times of pain. They were redeemed ultimately from Egypt. The promises that God delivered, that God made, were delivered. They were redeemed. So at some point, are you ready now to make a commitment? And you think about it, of course, the rational mind could always say, it's too risky, the commitment. I don't know what it'll entail, what will happen generations from now. What is this commitment going to do to me and to my children and grandchildren? But let's take another example, a military example. In military, and we know that military is a very good example for this. Once you enlist, you're committed. You get an order from a superior. Now, you can't start questioning and say, I want to understand it first. I want to read a book on it. I have a different opinion. That's court-martial. And military court-martial is a matter of life and death. You know why? Because the whole military is built on life and death. And you delaying 1 second an order can put many people in danger. So there's an absolute need for submission to authority. You don't want to enlist, don't enlist. But once you're in the military, it's all driven by, first I will do and then I will understand. So fine. That's why there's training, there's education. Like here, generations before, they learned about this God. Do you want a relationship with me? And if you do, you're in all the way. A soldier is a soldier even when you're asleep. It's total commitment. And if you think about it, that's unbelievable. It's beautiful. That's what you want in life. Do your due diligence. But that's preceding the relationship. Relationships are built on commitment. And when you do have preceding before it, remember, nobody gets married when they're newborns. You go through a childhood, an education, a family unit. You learn about love. Obviously, there's situations where families are unhealthy or dysfunctional, and that's an additional challenge. But assuming everything works out, you've learned about love. You learned about commitment. Now you go out and meet someone, and you don't just marry the first person you meet, but after you do the proper research, the proper due diligence, dating, now are you ready to go? And once you are, you're in all the way. Now, of course, you could ask the question, what happens if there's a breach in the relationship? You've betrayed, you're violated, you are, your trust, for good reason, has been compromised. That's another discussion. Then something that an extraneous event happened. But commitment itself, I remember asking someone who was having difficulty finding his soulmate. And I said to him, you ever hear of, we were going through the usual suspects. This reason, that reason. And he was telling me, I went through everything. I did everything. I said to him, did you ever hear of unconditional love? He said, yeah. If she has these elements, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'll give her unconditional love. So I said, did you hear what you said? You have conditions to give unconditional love. And then I said, do you have any blind spots? You say you worked it all out. He was looking to me for some mystical, Kabbalistic reason, a secret to, I don't know what he was looking for, of why it's not working. I said, we got to go through all that. He says, I went through everything. Do you have any blind spots? He says, yes, but I know where there are. So I realized who I was dealing with. Thank God I was able to help him by first showing him what real unconditional love is. Doesn't mean, no, you don't give unconditional love to every person you meet, every stranger. But it should always be part and parcel of your commitment to life. Unfortunately, ironically, in a world like ours, with all the technology and all our standard of living and all that gifts that we have, and the ease of accessing anything, anytime, everywhere, in an odd way, actually creates a sense of entitlement where we lose the most important thing, commitment. We have so many options. People tell me, I don't have time right now to make a commitment. I'm busy tasting. It's like going to a restaurant. I'm just tasting from all the foods. On the contrary, with so many gifts, commitment should be even more underscored and important. But it makes sense because you indulge and therefore you become, like I said, a sense of entitlement. You're spoiled. We have a commitment crisis. And that's why it's so powerful. That's why we call it a secret. It's called a secret in the Talmud. The secret of commitment. The secret of doing first and then understanding. Absolutely following whatever diligence or whatever research you need to do. But then once you're committed, real commitment. And not escaping to excuses and reasons and all kinds of other things. And that brings us to the power of the Kabbalah of action. Action. You can think about things from today till tomorrow. You could talk about it. But until you don't act, there's a certain line that has not been crossed. If you go to someone, and I have to deal with this, I raise money for our organization for different causes, and people say, beautiful cause. My heart is with you, my soul is with you, my mind is with you. Great. And you feel so good. You feel like you've succeeded in convincing the person to support your cause. If you don't leave with a check, or the person doesn't sign the dotted line, you've gone nowhere. Yeah, you've gotten their words, but there's something in this world of action. Obviously, it's important to get someone to capture their mind, their heart, the soul. But I once heard something from a real fundraising expert. He said to me, there's a mistake. People think that their investment follows their heart. No, their heart follows their investment. That's why it's so important to get a commitment from someone, even if it's a small commitment. Because once they're committed and they're in, then their heart is more responsive. They care more because they're already committed. That is a powerful secret. So in the Kabbalistic and Hasidic teachings, it talks about the power of action. That on one hand, action needs to be informed by strategy, by thought, and by words. You make a plan. You write up a plan. But then there's something that action does that thought and speech can never do. It turns it into a real reality. Even God, the mystics explain, wasn't enough just to think about existence and not just enough to speak about it, even though God's thought and speech can create. But it was important that they emphasized that it actually brought into an action. The power of action. Of an act. And that follows the power of commitment. So in addition to the military person following orders, the fact that they go out and do it and not just talk about it, that creates new realities. And you see people who are experts. They can give you every concept and every argument. But then when you say, so did you act on it? No. Why? All kinds of excuses. Now this can be applied to every aspect of our lives and should be applied. The secret of commitment. And it's actually an art. Now, of course, having good role models make a big difference. If you've seen people around you who are not committed, it's very likely that you will not be that committed because you see that's the option. If you see people who made a choice and stuck with that choice, there's something about that is so beautiful. The loyalty. You see people loyal to each other as long as they're getting what they want. And then when they don't need that other person, how often are they discarded, ignored? But then you see the rare instances where someone never forgets a favor done for them. Never forgets where they came from. And remembers and remains loyal to that memory. That's commitment. Now, is it logical? You could say, it's logical. I only have that much time in the day. Let me give that time to people who I benefit from. But then you're missing the most important thing in life, and that is the commitment part. That connection, that attachment, which is so vital to a human being. Ask yourself this question. Do you have people in your life that unconditionally care about you and love you? And no matter what you did, they'll be there. That doesn't mean that you can do whatever you like, you could hurt them. But it means that it's not about them. Obviously, if you do something that requires repair or remorse or correction, hopefully you'll do that. And then ask yourself the question the other way around. Do you have anyone, or anything that you unconditionally are committed to? It's not an easy question to answer. Because, we start thinking, is it really worth it? Should I be committed? But then I go back to the initial question, what would we be like if we did not have that type of attachment? Now it's interesting, God made it that mothers don't have a choice. The fetus developing the mother's womb is connected and attached to her for 9 months, whether she likes it or not, whether anyone likes it or not. Why couldn't God make it that, upon conception should be birth? Maybe it was to give the child not just oxygen, but the concept of attachment. And even if that mother, God forbid, was unable to really completely nurture the child after the child is born, but those 9 months will never be lost. So we all begin our lives not just loved, not just taken care of, completely submerged in the embryonic fluids, where everything, from our oxygen to our food, everything. And of course, the psyche developing in that type of environment. Think like a fish in water, completely connected to another person. Now, hopefully, after birth, that nurturing, that attachment, that love, that unconditional love continues. But we all have that head start, so to speak. And it's interesting, the Talmud also tells us that in that mother's womb, we are taught the entire Torah. That Torah that was accepted unconditionally will do, and then we'll understand is taught. It's downloaded and embedded in our very DNA and our very psyche. And that's why attachment is so integral and inherent within us. And it's when it's lacking, it's going to have consequences, which means we will search for that attachment one way or another. Some consider the greatest film ever made, Citizen Kane, Rosebud. What is Rosebud? You don't discover till the end of the film. Is that sled that William Kane, remembers as a child when he's taken away from his family, from his parents. The innocence of that sled in the snow, called Rosebud. And at the end of the film, it's just thrown into the fire. but a few times in his life he mentioned it. In a sense, that search for perfection, that search for paradise, the search for innocence, the search for our childhood purity, the search for attachment. We all need it. And you don't find it one way, you start looking other ways. Egos are built, false castles, false fantasies, different addictions, anything to satisfy that attachment, healthy or unhealthy. So it's time to rebuild healthy attachments, and it starts with commitment. I remember once a couple dating, as perpetually serial daters in New York City, were at my class. And after the class, they came over and they said they're dating a few years already. She's ready to get married. He's not. And they can't figure out. He can't figure out either. What's stopping him? So we decided I'll have a meeting one-on-one with him, man to man. We'll review it. So I remember we met in the
Scattamo stanotti, viri come balla, sutta e fanali chi si scidica. Ballamo stanotti, salta come un'anna, chi pettini di luna in sciolla. Gira musica, gira e non si ferma, come una galla do vento aitta. Attira con narina, tamburello e abbacia come sua figliola. Scattano stanotti, viri come balla, sutta e fanali chi si scidica. Ballamo stanotti, salta come un'anna, chi pettini di luna in sciolla. Sinni e tunu, i voti si danno, tuna poco gli bevuti. Sinda affettunu, i cappotti russi e si ricordano da notti buona. Scattamo stanotti, vini come balla, sutta e fanali chi si scidica. Ballamo stanotti, salta come un'anna, chi pettini di luna in sciolla.